Chapter 11. The Persuasion of Fashion, Feeling Guards Over Its Own. Carrie was an apt student of fortune's ways, of fortune's superficialities. Seeing a thing, she would immediately set to inquiring how she would look, properly related to it. Be it known that this is not a fine feeling, it is not wisdom. The greatest minds are not so afflicted, and on the contrary, the lowest order of mind is not so disturbed. Fine clothes to her were a vast persuasion. They spoke tenderly and Jesuitically for themselves. When she came within earshot of their pleading, desire in her bent a willing ear. The voice of the so-called inanimate. Who shall translate for us the language of the stones? My dear, said the lace collar she secured from Partridge's, I fit you beautifully. Don't give me up. Ah, such little feet, said the leather of the soft new shoes. How effectively I cover them. What a pity they should ever want my aid. Once these things were in her mind, on her person, she might dream of giving them up. The method by which they came might intrude itself so forcibly that she would ache to be rid of the thought of it. But she would not give them up. Put on the old clothes. That torn pair of shoes was called to her by her conscience in vain. She could possibly have conquered the fear of hunger and gone back. The thought of hard work and a narrow round of suffering would, under the last pressure of conscience, have yielded, but spoil her appearance? Be old clothed and poor appearing? Never. Drouet heightened her opinion on this and allied subjects in such a manner as to weaken her power of resisting their influence. It is so easy to do this when the thing opined in is in the line of what we desire. In his hearty way, he insisted upon her good looks. He looked at her admiringly, and she took it at its full value. Under the circumstances, she did not need to carry herself as pretty women do. She picked that knowledge up fast enough for herself. Drouet had a habit, characteristic of its kind, of looking after stylishly dressed or pretty women on the street and remarking upon them. He had just enough of the feminine love of dress to be a good judge, not of intellect, but of clothes. He saw how they set their little feet, how they carried their chins, with what grace and sinuosity they swung their bodies. A dainty, self-conscious swaying of the hips by a woman was to him as alluring as the glint of a rare wine to a toper. He would turn and follow the disappearing vision with his eyes. He would thrill as a child with the unhindered passion that was in him. He loved the thing that women love in themselves, grace. At this, their own shrine, he knelt with them, an ardent devotee. Did you see that woman who went by just now? He said to Carrie on the first day they took a walk together. Fine stepper, wasn't she? Carrie looked and observed the grace commended. Yes, she is, she returned cheerfully, a little suggestion of possible defect in herself awakening in her mind. If that was so fine, she must look at it more closely. Instinctively, she felt a desire to imitate it. Surely she could do that too. When one of her mind sees many things emphasized and re-emphasized and admired, she gathers the logic of it and applies accordingly. Drouet was not shrewd enough to see that this was not tactful. He could not see that it would be better to make her feel that she was competing with herself, not others better than herself. He would not have done it with an older, wiser woman, but in Carrie he saw only the novice. Less clever than she, he was naturally unable to comprehend her sensibility. He went on educating and wounding her, a thing rather foolish in one whose admiration for his pupil and victim was apt to grow. Carrie took the instructions affably. She saw what Drouet liked. In a vague way, she saw where he was weak. It lessens a woman's opinion of a man when she learns that his admiration is so pointedly and generously distributed. She sees but one object of supreme compliment in this world, and that is herself. If a man is to succeed with many women, he must be all in all to each. In her own apartments, Carrie saw things which were lessons in the same school. In the same house with her lived an official of one of the theaters, Mr. Frank A. Hale, manager of the Standard, and his wife, a pleasing-looking brunette of 35. They were people of a sort very common in America today, who live respectably from hand to mouth. Hale received a salary of $45 a week. His wife, quite attractive, affected the feeling of youth, and objected to that sort of home life which means the care of a house and the raising of a family. Like Drouet and Carrie, they also occupied 3 rooms on the floor above. Not long after she arrived, Mrs. Hale established social relations with her, and together they went about. For a long time this was her only companionship, and the gossip of the manager's wife formed the medium through which she saw the world. Such trivialities, such praises of wealth, such conventional expression of morals as sifted through this passive creature's mind, fell upon Carrie, and for the while confused her. On the other hand, her own feelings were a corrective influence. The constant drag to something better was not to be denied. By those things which address the heart was she steadily recalled. In the apartments across the hall were a young girl and her mother. They were from Evansville, Indiana, the wife and daughter of a railroad treasurer. The daughter was here to study music, the mother to keep her company. Carrie did not make their acquaintance, but she saw the daughter coming in and going out. A few times she had seen her at the piano in the parlor, and not infrequently had heard her play. This young woman was particularly dressy for her station, and wore a jeweled ring or two which flashed upon her white fingers as she played. Now Carrie was affected by music. Her nervous composition responded to certain strains, much as certain strings of a harp vibrate when a corresponding key of a piano is struck. She was delicately molded in sentiment, and answered with vague ruminations to certain wistful chords. They awoke longings for those things which she did not have. They caused her to cling closer to things she possessed. One short song the young lady played in a most soulful and tender mood. Carrie heard it through the open door from the parlor below. It was at that hour, between afternoon and night, when, for the idle, the wanderer, things are apt to take on a wistful aspect. The mind wanders forth on far journeys and returns with sheaves of withered and departed joys. Carrie sat at her window looking out. Drouet had been away since 10 in the morning. She had amused herself with a walk, a book by Bertha M. Clay, which Drouet had left there, though she did not wholly enjoy the latter, and by changing her dress for the evening. Now she sat looking out across the park as wistful and depressed as the nature which craves variety, and life can be under such circumstances. As she contemplated her new state, the strain from the parlor below stole upward. With it, her thoughts became colored and enmeshed. She reverted to the things which were best and saddest within the small limit of her experience. She became for a moment a repentant. While she was in this mood, Drouet came in, bringing with him an entirely different atmosphere. It was dusk, and Carrie had neglected to light the lamp. The fire in the grate, too, had burned low. "Where are you, Cad?" he said, using a pet name he had given her. "Here," she answered. There was something delicate and lonely in her voice, but he could not hear it. He had not the poetry in him that would seek a woman out under such circumstances and console her for the tragedy of life. Instead, he struck a match and lighted the gas. "Hello," he exclaimed. "You've been crying." Her eyes were still wet with a few vague tears. "Pshaw," he said, "you don't want to do that." He took her hand, feeling in his good-natured egotism that it was probably lack of his presence which had made her lonely. "Come on now," he went on, "it's all right. Let's waltz a little to that music." He could not have introduced a more incongruous proposition. It made clear to Carrie that he could not sympathize with her. She could not have framed thoughts which would have expressed his defect or made clear the difference between them, but she felt it. It was his first great mistake. What Drouet said about the girl's grace as she tripped out evenings, accompanied by her mother, caused Carrie to perceive the nature and value of those little modish ways which women adopt when they would presume to be something. She looked in the mirror and pursed up her lips, accompanying it with a little toss of the head, as she had seen the railroad treasurer's daughter do. She caught up her skirts with an easy swing, for had not Drouet remarked that in her and several others, and Carrie was naturally imitating, she began to get the hang of those little things which a pretty woman who has vanity invariably adopts. In short, her knowledge of grace doubled, and with it her appearance changed. She became a girl of considerable taste. Drouet noticed this. He saw the new bow in her hair and the new way of arranging her locks which she affected one morning. "You look fine that way, Cad," he said. "Do I?" she replied sweetly. It made her try for other effects that selfsame day. She used her feet less heavily, a thing that was brought about by her attempting to imitate the treasurer's daughter's graceful carriage. How much influence the presence of that young woman in the same house had upon her it would be difficult to say. But because of all these things, when Hurstwood called, he had found a young woman who was much more than the Carrie to whom Drouet had first spoken. The primary defects of dress and manner had passed. She was pretty, graceful, rich in the timidity born of uncertainty, and with something childlike in her large eyes which captured the fancy of the starched and conventional poser among men. It was the ancient attraction of the fresh for the stale. If there was a touch of appreciation left in him for the bloom and unsophistication which is the charm of youth, it rekindled now. He looked into her pretty face and felt the subtle waves of young life radiating therefrom. In that large, clear eye he could see nothing that his blasé nature could understand as guile. The little vanity, if he could have perceived it there, would have touched him as a pleasant thing. "I wonder," he said as he rode away in his cab, "how Drouet came to win her." He gave her credit for feeling superior to Drouet at the first glance. The cab plopped along between the far receding lines of gas lamps on either hand. He folded his gloves and saw only the lighted chamber in Carrie's face. He was pondering over the delight of youthful beauty. "I'll have a bouquet for her," he thought. "Drouet won't mind." He never for a moment concealed the fact of her attraction for himself. He troubled himself not at all about Drouet's priority. He was merely floating those gossamer threads of thought which, like the spiders, he hoped would lay hold somewhere. He did not know, he could not guess what the result would be. A few weeks later, Drouet, in his peregrinations, encountered one of his well-dressed lady acquaintances in Chicago on his return from a short trip to Omaha. He had intended to hurry out to Ogden Place and surprise Carrie, but now he fell into an interesting conversation and soon modified his original intention. "Let's go to dinner," he said, little recking any chance meeting which might trouble his way. "Certainly," said his companion. They visited one of the better restaurants for a social chat. It was 5 in the afternoon when they met. It was 7:30 before the last bone was picked. Drouet was just finishing a little incident he was relating, and his face was expanding into a smile, when Hurstwood's eye caught his own. The latter had come in with several friends, and seeing Drouet and some woman, not Carrie, drew his own conclusion. "Ah, the rascal," he thought, and then with a touch of righteous sympathy, "That's pretty hard on the little girl." Drouet jumped from one easy thought to another as he caught Hurstwood's eye. He felt but very little misgiving until he saw that Hurstwood was cautiously pretending not to see. Then some of the latter's impression forced itself upon him. He thought of Carrie and their last meeting. By George, he would have to explain this to Hurstwood. Such a chance half-hour with an old friend must not have anything more attached to it than it really warranted. For the first time, he was troubled. Here was a moral complication of which he could not possibly get the ends. Hurstwood would laugh at him for being a fickle boy. He would laugh with Hurstwood. Carrie would never hear. His present companion at the table would never know. And yet he could not help feeling that he was getting the worst of it. There was some faint stigma attached, and he was not guilty. He broke up the dinner by becoming dull and saw his companion on her car. Then he went home. He hasn't talked to me about any of these later flames, thought Hurstwood to himself. I think he cares for the girl out there. He ought not to think I'm knocking around since I have just introduced him out there, thought Drouet. I saw you, Hurstwood said, genially, the next time Drouet drifted into his polished resort, from which he could not stay away. He raised his forefinger indicatively, as parents do to children. An old acquaintance of mine that I ran into just as I was coming up from the station, explained Drouet. She used to be quite a beauty. Still attracts a little, eh? Returned the other, affecting to jest. Oh no, said Drouet, just couldn't escape her this time. How long are you here? Asked Hurstwood. Only a few days. You must bring the girl down and take dinner with me, he said. I'm afraid you keep her cooped up out there. I'll get a box for Joe Jefferson. Not me, answered the drummer. Sure, I'll come. This pleased Hurstwood immensely. He gave Drouet no credit for any feelings toward Carrie whatever. He envied him, and now, as he looked at the well-dressed, jolly salesman whom he so much liked, the gleam of the rival glowed in his eye. He began to size up Drouet from the standpoints of wit and fascination. He began to look to see where he was weak. There was no disputing that, whatever he might think of him as a good fellow, he felt a certain amount of contempt for him as a lover. He could hoodwink him all right. Why, if he would just let Carrie see one such little incident as that of Thursday, it would settle the matter. He ran on in thought, almost exulting, the while he laughed and chatted, and Drouet felt nothing. He had no power of analyzing the glance and the atmosphere of a man like Hurstwood. He stood and smiled and accepted the invitation, while his friend examined him with the eye of a hawk. The object of this peculiarly involved comedy was not thinking of either. She was busy adjusting her thoughts and feelings to newer conditions, and was not in danger of suffering disturbing pangs from either quarter. One evening, Drouet found her dressing herself before the glass. Cad, said he, catching her, I believe you're getting vain. Nothing of the kind, she returned, smiling. Well, you're mighty pretty, he went on, slipping his arm around her. Put on that navy blue dress of yours and I'll take you to the show. Oh, I promised Mrs. Hale to go with her to the exposition tonight, she returned apologetically. You did, eh? He said, studying the situation abstractedly. I wouldn't care to go to that myself. Well, I don't know, answered Carrie, puzzling, but not offering to break her promise in his favor. Just then a knock came at their door, and the maidservant handed a letter in. He says there's an answer expected, she explained. It's from Hurstwood, said Drouet, noting the superscription as he tore it open. You are to come down and see Joe Jefferson with me tonight, it ran in part. It's my turn, as we agreed the other day. All other bets are off. Well, what do you say to this? Asked Drouet innocently, while Carrie's mind bubbled with favorable replies. You had better decide, Charlie, she said reservedly. I guess we had better go if you can break that engagement upstairs, said Drouet. Oh, I can, returned Carrie without thinking. Drouet selected writing paper while Carrie went to change her dress. She hardly explained to herself why this latest invitation appealed to her most. "Shall I wear my hair as I did yesterday?" she asked, as she came out with several articles of apparel pending. "Sure," he returned pleasantly. She was relieved to see that he felt nothing. She did not credit her willingness to go to any fascination Hurstwood held for her. It seemed that the combination of Hurstwood, Drouet, and herself was more agreeable than anything else that had been suggested. She arrayed herself most carefully, and they started off, extending excuses upstairs. "I say," said Hurstwood as they came up the theater lobby, "we are exceedingly charming this evening." Carrie fluttered under his approving glance. "Now then," he said, leading the way up the foyer into the theater. "If ever there was dressiness, it was here. It was the personification of the old term spick and span. Did you ever see Jefferson?" he questioned as he leaned toward Carrie in the box. "I never did," she returned. "He's delightful, delightful," he went on, giving the commonplace rendition of approval which such men know. He sent Drouet after a program, and then discoursed to Carrie concerning Jefferson as he had heard of him. The former was pleased beyond expression, and was really hypnotized by the environment, the trappings of the box, the elegance of her companion. Several times their eyes accidentally met, and then there poured into her such a flooding of feeling as she had never before experienced. She could not for the moment explain it, for in the next glance or the next move of the hand there was seeming indifference, mingled only with the kindest attention. Drouet shared in the conversation, but he was almost dull in comparison. Hurstwood entertained them both, and now it was driven into Carrie's mind that here was the superior man. She instinctively felt that he was stronger and higher, and yet withal so simple. By the end of the third act, she was sure that Drouet was only a kindly soul, but otherwise defective. He sank every moment in her estimation by the strong comparison. "I have had such a nice time," said Carrie, when it was all over and they were coming out. "Yes, indeed," added Drouet, who was not in the least aware that a battle had been fought and his defenses weakened. He was like the Emperor of China, who sat glorying in himself, unaware that his fairest provinces were being wrested from him. "Well, you have saved me a dreary evening," returned Hurstwood. "Good night." He took Carrie's little hand, and a current of feeling swept from one to the other. "I'm so tired," said Carrie, leaning back in the car when Drouet began to talk. "Well, you rest a little while I smoke," he said, rising. And then he foolishly went to the forward platform of the car and left the game as it stood. Chapter 12. Of the Lamps of the Mansions, the Ambassador's Plea. Mrs. Hurstwood was not aware of any of her husband's moral defections, though she might readily have suspected his tendencies, which she well understood. She was a woman upon whose action under provocation you could never count. Hurstwood, for one, had not the slightest idea of which under certain circumstances. He had never seen her thoroughly aroused. In fact, she was not a woman who would fly into a passion. She had too little faith in mankind not to know that they were erring. She was too calculating to jeopardize any advantage she might gain in the way of information by fruitless clamor. Her wrath would never wreak itself in one fell blow. She would wait and brood, studying the details and adding to them until her power might be commensurate with her desire for revenge. At the same time, she would not delay to inflict any injury, big or little, which would wound the object of her revenge and still leave him uncertain as to the source of the evil. She was a cold, self-centered woman with many a thought of her own which never found expression, not even by so much as the glint of an eye. Hurstwood felt some of this in her nature, though he did not actually perceive it. He dwelt with her in peace and some satisfaction. He did not fear her in the least. There was no cause for it. She still took a faint pride in him, which was augmented by her desire to have her social integrity maintained. She was secretly somewhat pleased by the fact that much of her husband's property was in her name, a precaution which Hurstwood had taken when his home interests were somewhat more alluring than at present. His wife had not the slightest reason to feel that anything would ever go amiss with their household, and yet the shadows which run before gave her a thought of the good of it now and then. She was in a position to become refractory with considerable advantage, and Hurstwood conducted himself circumspectly because he felt that he could not be sure of anything once she became dissatisfied. It so happened that on the night when Hurstwood, Carrie, and Drouet were in the box at McVicker's, George Jr. was in the 6th row of the parquet with the daughter of H.B. Carmichael, the third partner of a wholesale dry goods house of that city. Hurstwood did not see his son, for he sat, as his wont, as far back as possible, leaving himself just partially visible when he bent forward to those within the first 6 rows in question. It was his wont to sit this way in every theater, to make his personality as inconspicuous as possible, where it would be no advantage to him to have it otherwise. He never moved, but what if there was any danger of his conduct being misconstrued or ill-reported? He looked carefully about him and counted the cost of every inch of conspicuity. The next morning at breakfast, his son said, "I saw you, Governor, last night." "Were you at McVicker's?" said Hurstwood, with the best grace in the world. "Yes," said young George. "Who with?" "Miss Carmichael." Mrs. Hurstwood directed an inquiring glance at her husband, but could not judge from his appearance whether it was any more than a casual look into the theater which he was referred to. "How was the play?" she inquired. "Very good," returned Hurstwood. "Only it's the same old thing, Rip Van Winkle." "Whom did you go with?" queried his wife, with assumed indifference. "Charlie Drouet and his wife. They are friends of Moy's, visiting here." Owing to the peculiar nature of his position, such a disclosure as this would ordinarily create no difficulty. His wife took it for granted that his situation called for certain social movements in which she might not be included. But of late he had pleaded office duty on several occasions when his wife asked for his company to any evening entertainment. He had done so in regard to the very evening in question only the morning before. "I thought you were going to be busy," she remarked, very carefully. "So I was," he exclaimed. "I couldn't help the interruption, but I made up for it afterward by working until 2. This settled the discussion for the time being, but there was a residue of opinion which was not satisfactory. There was no time at which the claims of his wife could have been more unsatisfactorily pushed. For years he had been steadily modifying his matrimonial devotion, and found her company dull. Now that a new light shone upon the horizon, this older luminary paled in the west. He was satisfied to turn his face away entirely, and any call to look back was irksome. She, on the contrary, was not at all inclined to accept anything less than a complete fulfillment of the letter of their relationship, though the spirit might be wanting. "We are coming downtown this afternoon," she remarked a few days later. "I want you to come over to Kinsley's and meet Mr. Phillips and his wife. They're stopping at the Tremont, and we're going to show them around a little." After the occurrence of Wednesday, he could not refuse, though the Phillips were about as uninteresting as vanity and ignorance could make them. He agreed, but it was with short grace. He was angry when he left the house. "I'll put a stop to this," he thought. "I'm not going to be bothered fooling around with visitors when I have work to do." Not long after this, Mrs. Hurstwood came with a similar proposition, only it was to a matinee this time. "My dear," he returned, "I haven't time. I'm too busy." You find time to go with other people, though, she replied, with considerable irritation. Nothing of the kind, he answered. I can't avoid business relations, and that's all there is to it. Well, never mind, she exclaimed. Her lips tightened. The feeling of mutual antagonism was increased. On the other hand, his interest in Drouet's little shop girl grew in an almost evenly balanced proportion. That young lady, under the stress of her situation and the tutelage of her new friend, changed effectively. She had the aptitude of the struggler who seeks emancipation. The glow of a more showy life was not lost upon her. She did not grow in knowledge so much as she awakened in the matter of desire. Mrs. Hale's extended harangues upon the subjects of wealth and position taught her to distinguish between degrees of wealth. Mrs. Hale loved to drive in the afternoon in the sun when it was fine, and to satisfy her soul with a sight of those mansions and lawns which she could not afford. On the north side, she had been erected a number of elegant mansions. Okay, one more time. On the north side had been erected a number of elegant mansions along what is now known as the North Shore Drive. The present lake wall of stone and granitoid was not then in place, but the road had been well laid out. The intermediate spaces of lawn were lovely to look upon, and the houses were thoroughly new and imposing. When the winter season had passed and the first fine days of the early spring appeared, Mrs. Hale secured a buggy for an afternoon and invited Carrie. They rode first through Lincoln Park and on far out towards Evanston, turning back at 4 and arriving at the north end of the shore drive at about 5 o'clock. At this time of year, the days are still comparatively short, and the shadows of the evening to settle down upon the great city. Lamps were beginning to burn with that mellow radiance which seems almost watery and translucent to the eye. There was a softness in the air which speaks with an infinite delicacy of feeling to the flesh as well as to the soul. Carrie felt that it was a lovely day. She was ripened by it in spirit for many suggestions. As they drove along the smooth pavement, an occasional carriage passed. She saw one stop and the footman dismount, opening the door for a gentleman who seemed to be leisurely returning from some afternoon pleasure. Across the broad lawns, now first freshening into green, she saw lamps faintly glowing upon rich interiors. Now it was but a chair, now a table, now an ornate corner which met her eye. But it appealed to her as almost nothing else could. Such childish fancies as she had of fairy palaces and kingly quarters now came back. She imagined that across these richly carved entranceways, where the globed and crystalled lamps shone upon paneled doors set with stained and designed panes of glass, was neither care nor unsatisfied desire. She was perfectly certain that here was happiness. If she could but stroll up yon broad walk, cross that rich entranceway, which to her was of the beauty of a jewel, and sweep in grace and luxury to possession and command, oh, how quickly would sadness flee! How in an instant would the heartache end! She gazed and gazed, wondering, delighting, longing, and all the while, in the siren voice of the unrestful was whispering in her ear. If we could have such a home as that, said Mrs. Hale sadly, how delightful it would be. And yet they do say, said Carrie, that no one is ever happy. She had heard so much of the canting philosophy of the grapeless fox. I notice, said Mrs. Hale, that they all try mighty hard, though, to take their misery in a mansion. When she came to her own rooms, Carrie saw their comparative insignificance. She was not so dull but that she could perceive they were but 3 small rooms in a moderately well-furnished boarding house. She was not contrasting it now with what she had had, but what she had so recently seen. The glow of the palatial doors was still in her eye. the roll of cushioned carriages still in her ears. What, after all, was Drouet? What was she? At her window she thought it over, rocking to and fro, and gazing out across the lamplit park toward the lamplit houses on Warren and Ashland avenues. She was too wrought up to care to go down to eat, too pensive to do aught but rock and sing. Some old tunes crept to her lips, and as she sang them her heart sank. She longed and longed and longed. It was now for the old cottage room in Columbia City, now the mansion up upon the shore drive, now the fine dress of some lady, now the elegance of some scene. She was sad beyond measure, and yet uncertain, wishing, fancying. Finally, it seemed as if all her state was one of loneliness and forsakenness, and she could scarce refrain from trembling at the lip. She hummed and hummed as the moments went by, sitting in the shadow by the window, and was therein as happy, though she did not perceive it, as she would ever be. While Carrie was still in this frame of mind, the house servant brought up the intelligence that Mr. Hurstwood was in the parlor asking to see Mr. and Mrs. Drouet. I guess he doesn't know that Charlie is out of town, thought Carrie. She had seen comparatively little of the manager during the winter, but had been kept constantly in mind of him by one thing and another, principally by the strong impression he had made. She was quite disturbed for the moment as to her appearance, but soon satisfied herself by the aid of the mirror and went below. Hurstwood was in his best form, as usual. He hadn't heard that Drouet was out of town. He was but slightly affected by the intelligence and devoted himself to the more general topics which would interest Carrie. It was surprising, the ease with which he conducted a conversation. He was like every man who has had the advantage of practice and knows he has sympathy. He knew that Carrie listened to him pleasurably, and without the least effort he fell into a train of observation which absorbed her fancy. He drew up his chair and modulated his voice to such a degree that what he said seemed wholly confidential. He confined himself almost exclusively to his observation of men and pleasures. He had been here and there, he had seen this and that. Somehow he wished to see similar things, and all the while kept her aware of himself. She could not shut out the consciousness of his individuality and presence for a moment. He would raise his eyes slowly in smiling emphasis of something, and she was fixed by their magnetism. He would draw out, with the easiest grace, her approval. Once he touched her hand for emphasis, and she only smiled. He seemed to radiate an atmosphere which suffused her being. He was never dull for a minute, and seemed to make her clever. At least, she brightened under his influence until all her best side was exhibited. She felt that she was more clever with him than with others. At least, he seemed to find so much in her to applaud. There was not the slightest touch of patronage. Drouet was full of it. There had been something so personal, so subtle in each meeting between them, both when Drouet was present and when he was absent, that Carrie could not speak of it without feeling a sense of difficulty. She was no talker. She could never arrange her thoughts in fluent order. It was always a matter of feeling with her, strong and deep. Each time there had been no sentence of importance which she could relate, and as for the glances and sensations, what woman would reveal them? Such things had never been between her and Drouet. As a matter of fact, they could never be. She had been dominated by distress and the enthusiastic forces of relief which Drouet represented at an opportune moment when she yielded to him. Now she was persuaded by secret, current feelings which Drouet had never understood. Hurstwood's glance was as effective as the spoken words of a lover, and more. They called for no immediate decision and could not be answered. People in general attach too much importance to words. They are under the illusion that talking affects great results. As a matter of fact, words are, as a rule, the shallowest portion of all the argument. They but dimly represent the great surging feelings and desires which lie behind. When the distraction of the tongue is removed, the heart listens. In this conversation she heard, instead of his words, the voices of the things which he represented. How suave was the counsel of his appearance! How feelingly did his superior state speak for itself! The growing desire he felt for her lay upon her spirit as a gentle hand. She did not need to tremble at all because it was invisible. She did not need to worry over what other people would say, what she herself would say, because it had no tangibility. She was being pleaded with, persuaded, led into denying old rights and assuming new ones, and yet there were no words to prove it. Such conversation as was indulged and held the same relationship to the actual mental enactments of the twain that the low music of the orchestra does to the dramatic incident which it is used to cover. "Have you ever seen the houses along the lake shore on the north side?" asked Hurstwood. "Why, I was just over there this afternoon. Mrs. Hale and I." "Aren't they beautiful?" "They're very fine," he answered. "Oh me," said Carrie pensively, "I wish I could live in such a place." "You're not happy," said Hurstwood, slowly, after a slight pause. He had raised his eyes solemnly and was looking into her own. He assumed that he had struck a deep chord. Now was a slight chance to say a word in his own behalf. He leaned over quietly and continued his steady gaze. He felt the critical character of the period. She endeavored to stir, but it was useless. The whole strength of a man's nature was working. He had good cause to urge him on. He looked, and the longer the situation lasted, the more difficult it became. The little shop girl was getting into deep water. She was letting her few supports float away from her. "Oh," she said at last, "you mustn't look at me like that." "I can't help it," he answered. She relaxed a little and let the situation endure, giving him strength. "You are not satisfied with life, are you?" "No," she answered weakly. He saw he was the master of the situation. He felt it. He reached over and touched her hand. "You mustn't," she exclaimed, jumping up. "I didn't intend to," he answered easily. She did not run away, as she might have done. She did not terminate the interview, but he drifted off into a pleasant field of thought with the readiest grace. Not long after he rose to go, and she felt that he was in power. "You mustn't feel bad," he said kindly. "Things will straighten out in the course of time." She made no answer because she could think of nothing to say. "We are good friends, aren't we?" he said, extending his hand. "Yes," she answered. "Not a word then until I see you again." He retained a hold on her hand. "I can't promise," she said doubtfully. "You must be more generous than that," he said, in such a simple way that she was touched. "Let's not talk about it any more," she returned. "All right," he said, brightening. He went down the steps and into his cab. Carrie closed the door and descended into her room. She undid her broad lace collar before the mirror and unfastened her pretty alligator belt, which she had recently bought. "I'm getting terrible," she said, honestly affected by a feeling of trouble and shame. "I don't seem to do anything right." She unloosened her hair after a time and let it hang in loose brown waves. Her mind was going over the events of the evening. "I don't know," she murmured at last, "what I can do." "Well," said Hurstwood as he rode away, She likes me all right, that I know. The aroused manager whistled merrily for a good 4 miles to his office, an old melody that he had not recalled for 15 years. Chapter 13. His credentials accepted, a babble of tongues. It was not quite 2 days after the scene between Carrie and Hurstwood in the Ogden Place parlor before he again put in his appearance. He had been thinking almost uninterruptedly of her. Her leniency had, in a way, inflamed his regard. He felt that he must succeed with her, and that speedily. The reason for his interest, not to say fascination, was deeper than mere desire. It was a flowering out of feelings which had been withering in dry and almost barren soil for many years. It is probable that Carrie represented a better order of woman than had ever attracted him before. He had had no love affair since that which culminated in his marriage, and since then time and the world had taught him how raw and erroneous was his original judgment. Whenever he thought of it, he told himself that, if he had to do it over again, he would never marry such a woman. At the same time, his experience with women in general had lessened his respect for the sex. He maintained a cynical attitude, well grounded on numerous experiences. Such women as he had known were of nearly one type: selfish, ignorant, flashy. The wives of his friends were not inspiring to look upon. His own wife had developed a cold, commonplace nature which to him was anything but pleasing. What he knew of that underworld where grovel the beastmen of society, and he knew a great deal, had hardened his nature. He looked upon most women with suspicion, a single eye to the utility of beauty and dress. He followed them with a keen, suggestive glance. At the same time, he was not so dull but that a good woman commanded his respect. Personally, he did not attempt to analyze the marvel of a saintly woman. He would take off his hat and would silence the light-tongued and the vicious in her presence, much as the Irish keeper of a Bowery Hall will humble himself before a sister of mercy, and pay toll to charity with a willing and reverent hand. But he would not think much upon the question of why he did so. A man in his situation who comes, after a long round of worthless or hardening experiences, upon a young, unsophisticated, innocent soul, is apt either to hold aloof out of a sense of his own remoteness, or to draw near and become fascinated and elated by his discovery. It is only by a roundabout process that such men ever do draw near such a girl. They have no method, no understanding of how to ingratiate themselves in youthful favor, save when they find virtue in the toils. If, unfortunately, the fly has got caught in the net, the spider can come forth and talk business upon its own terms. So when maidenhood has wandered into the moil of the city, when it is brought within the circle of the rounder and the rue, even though it be at the outermost rim, they can come forth and use their alluring arts. Hurstwood had gone, at Drouet's invitation, to meet a new baggage of fine clothes and pretty features. He entered, expecting to indulge in an evening of lightsome frolic, and then lose track of the newcomer forever. Instead, he found a woman whose youth and beauty attracted him. In the mild light of Carrie's eye was nothing of the calculation of the mistress. In the diffident manner was nothing of the art of the courtesan. He saw at once that a mistake had been made, that some difficult conditions had pushed this troubled creature into his presence, and his interest was enlisted. Here sympathy sprang to the rescue, but it was not unmixed with selfishness. He wanted to win Carrie because he thought her fate mingled with his was better than if it were untied with Drouet's. He envied the drummer his conquest as he had never envied any man in all the course of his experience. Carrie was certainly better than this man, as she was superior mentally to Drouet. She came fresh from the air of the village, the light of the country still in her eye. Here was neither guile nor rapacity. There were slight inherited traits of both in her, but they were rudimentary. She was too full of wonder and desire to be greedy. She still looked about her upon the great maze of the city without understanding. Hurstwood felt the bloom and the youth. He picked her as he would the fresh fruit of a tree. He felt as fresh in her presence as one who was taken out of the flash of summer to the first cool breath of spring. Carrie, left alone since the scene in question and having no one with whom to counsel, had at first wandered from one strange mental conclusion to another, until at last, tired out, she gave it up. She owed something to Drouet, she thought. It did not seem more than yesterday that he had aided her when she was worried and distressed. She had the kindliest feelings for him in every way. She gave him credit for his good looks, his generous feelings, and even, in fact, failed to recollect his egotism when he was absent. But she could not feel any binding influence keeping her for him as against all others. In fact, such a thought had never had any grounding, even in Drouet's desires. The truth is that this goodly drummer carried the doom of all enduring relationships in his own lightsome manner and unstable fancy. He went merrily on, assured that he was alluring all, that affection followed tenderly in his wake, that things would endure unchangingly for his pleasure. When he missed some old face or found some door finally shut to him, it did not grieve him deeply. He was too young, too successful. He would remain thus young in spirit until he was dead. As for Hurstwood, he was alive, with thoughts and feelings concerning Carrie. He had no definite plans regarding her, but he was determined to make her confess an affection for him. He thought he saw in her drooping eye, her unstable glance, her wavering manner, the symptoms of a budding passion. He wanted to stand near her and to make her lay her hand in his. He wanted to find out what her next step would be, what the next sign of feeling for him would be. Such anxiety and enthusiasm had not affected him for years. He was a youth again in feeling, a cavalier in action. In his position, opportunity for taking his evenings out was excellent. He was a most faithful worker in general and a man who commanded the confidence of his employers insofar as the distribution of his time was concerned. He could take such hours off as he chose, for it was well known that he fulfilled his managerial duties successfully, whatever time he might take. His grace, tact, and ornate appearance gave the place an air which was most essential, while at the time his long experience made him a most excellent judge of its stock necessities. Bartenders and assistants might come and go, singly or in groups, but so long as he was present, the host of old-time customers would barely notice the change. He gave the place the atmosphere to which they were used. Consequently, he arranged his hours very much to suit himself, taking now an afternoon, now an evening, but invariably returning between 11 and 12 to witness the last hour or two of the day's business and look after the closing details. "You see that things are safe and all the employees are out when you go home, George," Moy had once remarked to him, and he never once, in all the period of his long service, neglected to do this. Neither of the owners had for years been in the resort after 5 in the afternoon, and yet their manager as faithfully fulfilled this request as if they had been there regularly to observe. On this Friday afternoon, scarcely 2 days after his previous visit, he made up his mind to see Carrie. He could not stay away longer. "Evans," he said, addressing the head barkeeper, "if anyone calls, I will be back between 4 and 5. He hurried to Madison Street and boarded his car, which carried him to Ogden Place in half an hour. Carrie had thought of going for a walk, and had put on a light gray woolen dress with a jaunty double-breasted jacket. She had out her hat and gloves, and was fastening a white lace tie about her throat. When the housemaid brought up the information that Mr. Hurstwood wished to see her, she started slightly at the announcement, but told the girls to say that she would come down in a moment and proceeded to hasten her dressing. Carrie could not have told herself at this moment whether she was glad or sorry that the impressive manager was awaiting her presence. She was slightly flurried and tingling in the cheeks, but it was more nervousness than either fear or favor. She did not try to conjecture what the drift of the conversation would be. She only felt that she must be careful and that Hurstwood had indefinable fascination for her. Then she gave her tie its last touch with her fingers and went below. The deep-feeling manager was himself a little strained in the nerves by the thorough consciousness of his mission. He felt that he must make a strong play on this occasion, but now that the hour was come, and he heard Carrie's feet upon the stair, his nerve failed him. He sank a little in determination, for he was not so sure, after all, what her opinion might be. When she entered the room, however, her appearance gave him courage. She looked simple and charming enough to strengthen the daring of any lover. Her apparent nervousness dispelled his own. "How are you?" he said easily. "I could not resist the temptation to come out this afternoon. It was so pleasant." "Yes," said Carrie, halting before him. "I was just preparing to go for a walk myself." "Oh, were you?" he said. "Supposing, then, you get your hat and we both go." They crossed the park and went west along Washington Boulevard, beautiful with its broad macadamized road and large frame houses set back from the sidewalk. It was a street where many of the more prosperous residents of the West Side lived, and Hurstwood could not help feeling nervous over the publicity of it. They had gone but a few blocks when a livery stable sign in one of the side streets solved the difficulty for him. He would take her to drive along the new boulevard. The boulevard at that time was little more than a country road. The part he intended showing her was much farther out on this same west side, where there was scarcely a house. It connected Douglas Park with Washington or South Park, and was nothing more than a neatly made road, running due south for some 5 miles over an open, grassy prairie, and then due east over the same kind of prairie for the same distance. There was not a house to be encountered anywhere along the larger part of the route, and any conversation would be pleasantly free of interruption. At the stable he picked a gentle horse, and they were soon out of range of either public observation or hearing. "Can you drive?" he said after a time. "I never tried," said Carrie. He put the reins in her hand and folded his arms. "You see, there's nothing to it much," he said smilingly. "Not when you have a gentle horse," said Carrie. "You can handle a horse as well as anyone after a little practice," he added encouragingly. He had been looking for some time for a break in the conversation when he could give it a serious turn. Once or twice he had held his peace, hoping that in silence her thoughts would take the color of his own. But she had lightly continued the subject. Presently, however, his silence controlled the situation. The drift of his thoughts began to tell. He gazed fixedly at nothing in particular, as if he were thinking of something which concerned her not at all. His thoughts, however, spoke for themselves. She was very much aware that a climax was pending. "Do you know," he said, "I have spent the happiest evenings in years since I have known you." "Have you?" she said, with assumed airiness, but still excited by the conviction which the tone of his voice carried. "I was going to tell you the other evening," he added, "but somehow the opportunity slipped away." Carrie was listening without attempting to reply. She could think of nothing worthwhile to say. Despite all the ideas concerning Wright, which had troubled her vaguely since she had last seen him, she was now influenced again strongly in his favor. "I came out here today," he went on solemnly, "to tell you just how I feel, to see if you wouldn't listen to me." Hurstwood was something of a romanticist after his kind. He was capable of strong feelings, often poetic ones, and under a stress of desire such as the present he waxed eloquent. That is, his feelings and his voice were colored with that seeming repression and pathos, which is the essence of eloquence. You know, putting his hand on her arm and keeping a strange silence while he formulated words, "that I love you." Carrie did not stir at the words. She was bound up completely in the man's atmosphere. He would have church-like silence in order to express his feelings, and she kept it. She did not move her eyes from the flat, open scene before her. Hurstwood waited for a few moments and then repeated the words. "You must not say that," she said weakly. Her words were not convincing at all. They were the result of a feeble thought that something ought to be said. He paid no attention to them whatever. "Carrie," he said, using her first name with sympathetic familiarity, "I want you to love me. You don't know how much I need someone to waste a little affection on me. I am practically alone. There is nothing in my life that is pleasant or delightful. It's all work and worry with people who are nothing to me." As he said this, Hurstwood really imagined that his state was pitiful. He had the ability to get off at a distance and view himself objectively, of seeing what he wanted to see in the things which made up his existence. Now, as he spoke, his voice trembled with that peculiar vibration which is the result of tensity. It went ringing home to his companion's heart. "Why, I should think," she said, turning upon him large eyes which were full of sympathy and feeling, "that you would be very happy. You know so much of the world." "That is it," he said, his voice dropping to a soft minor. "I know too much of the world." It was an important thing to her to hear one so well positioned and powerful speaking in this manner. She could not help feeling the strangeness of her situation. How was it that, in so little a while, the narrow life of the country had fallen from her as a garment, and the city, with all its mystery, taken its place? Here was this greatest mystery, the man of money and affairs sitting beside her, appealing to her. Behold, he had ease and comfort, his strength was great, his position high, his clothing rich, and yet he was appealing to her. She could formulate no thought which would be just and right. She troubled herself no more upon the matter. She only basked in the warmth of his feeling, which was as a grateful blaze to one who is cold. Hurstwood glowed with his own intensity, and the heat of his passion was already melting the wax of his companion's scruples. "You think," he said, "I am happy, that I ought not to complain? If you were to meet all day with people who care absolutely nothing about you, if you went day after day to a place where there was nothing but show and indifference, if there was not one person in all those you knew to whom you could appeal for sympathy or talk to with pleasure, perhaps you would be unhappy too." He was striking a chord now which found a sympathetic response in her own situation. She knew what it was to meet with people who were indifferent, to walk alone amid so many who cared absolutely nothing about you. Had not she? Was not she at this very moment quite alone? Who was there among all whom she knew to whom she could appeal for sympathy? Not one. She was left to herself to brood and wonder. I could be content, went on Hurstwood, if I had you to love me, if I had you to go to, you for a companion. As it is, I simply move about from place to place without any satisfaction. Time hangs heavily on my hands. Before you came, I did nothing but idle and drift into anything that offered itself. Since you came, well, I've had you to think about. The old illusion that here was someone who needed her aid began to grow in Carrie's mind. She truly pitied this sad, lonely figure. To think that all his fine state should be so barren for want of her. That he needed to make such an appeal when she herself was lonely and without anchor. Surely this was too bad. I am not very bad, he said apologetically, as if he owed it to her to explain on this score. You think, probably, that I roam around and get into all sorts of evil. I have been rather reckless, but I could easily come out of that. I need you to draw me back, if my life ever amounts to anything. Carrie looked at him with the tenderness which virtue ever feels in its hope of reclaiming vice. How could such a man need reclaiming? His errors, what were they, that she could correct? Small they must be, where all was so fine. At worst, they were gilded affairs, and with what leniency are gilded errors viewed? He put himself in such a lonely light that she was deeply moved. Is it that way? She mused. He slipped his arm about her waist, and she could not find the heart to draw away. With his free hand he seized upon her fingers. A breath of soft spring wind went bounding over the road, rolling some brown twigs of the previous autumn before it. The horse paced leisurely on, unguided. Tell me, he said softly, that you love me. Her eyes fell consciously. Own to it, dear, he said feelingly. You do, don't you? She made no answer, but he felt his victory. Tell me, he said, richly drawing her so close that their lips were near together. He pressed her hand warmly and then released it to touch her cheek. You do, he said, pressing his lips to her own. For answer, her lips replied. Now, he said joyously, his fine eyes ablaze, you're my own girl, aren't you? By way of further conclusion, her head lay softly upon his shoulder.